I'm a millionaire, and I was surprised by a little girl on the street. She stopped me and said, I know you, your picture is in my dad's wallet. And I was shocked by what she said. I've always believed that life has a peculiar way of surprising us when we least expect it. For me, that surprise came on a crisp autumn morning in New York City, a day that seemed no different from any other in my meticulously scheduled life. My name is Alexander Reeves, and until that fateful day, I was nothing more than a successful businessman, a millionaire with more zeros in my bank account than meaningful relationships in my life. I had spent years building my empire, Reeves Enterprises, from the ground up. My days were filled with board meetings, conference calls, and strategic planning sessions. My nights, well, they were often spent alone in my penthouse apartment, overlooking a city that never slept, while I grappled with an emptiness that no amount of success could fill. That morning, I was headed to a crucial meeting with potential investors. My driver, James, maneuvered through the bustling streets of Manhattan with practiced ease. I sat in the back, my attention divided between the financial reports on my tablet and the blur of people outside the tinted windows. It was a routine I had perfected over the years, efficient, predictable, and utterly devoid of surprises. As we stopped at a red light, I glanced up from my tablet, my eyes drawn to a small commotion on the sidewalk. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, had dropped her backpack, spilling its contents across the pavement. As she scrambled to gather her belongings, her father knelt beside her, helping to collect the scattered items. I was about to look away, to return to the safety of my financial projections and PowerPoint presentations, when something made me pause. The man helping the child, there was something hauntingly familiar about him. His profile, the way he moved, it stirred a long-forgotten memory deep within me. Before I could process what I was seeing, the little girl's eyes met mine through the car window. Her face lit up with a mixture of surprise and excitement. She tugged on her father's sleeve, pointing directly at me. "Daddy, look! It's the man from your wallet picture." Her words, muffled through the glass, sent a jolt through my system. I found myself reaching for the door handle, a move so uncharacteristic that James turned to me in surprise. "Mr. Reeves, is everything all right?" I barely heard him. My focus was entirely on the man who had now straightened up, his eyes meeting mine with a look of shock that I'm sure mirrored my own. "Thomas?" I whispered, hardly daring to believe it. The name felt foreign on my tongue, a relic from a past I had long tried to forget. Thomas Reeves, my younger brother, the one I hadn't seen or spoken to in over a decade. Without thinking, I stepped out of the car, ignoring James's concerned questions. The busy New York street faded into the background as I approached Thomas and the little girl. "Alex?" Thomas's voice was a mix of disbelief and wariness. "What are you doing here?" I stood there, suddenly at a loss for words. How do you start a conversation with the brother you've neglected for years? The brother whose existence you've tried to erase from your mind? The little girl looked between us, her bright eyes filled with curiosity. "Daddy, is this your brother? The one in the picture?" Thomas nodded slowly, his hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder. "Yes, Emma, this is your Uncle Alex." Uncle Alex. The title hit me like a physical blow. I had a niece, this vibrant, inquisitive little girl, and I hadn't even known of her existence until this moment. "Hi, Uncle Alex." Emma's cheerful voice cut through the tension. "I'm Emma. I'm 7 3/4. Do you really live in a big tower like Daddy says?" Her innocence and enthusiasm were disarming. For the first time in years, I felt a genuine smile tugging at my lips. "Hello, Emma. It's wonderful to meet you, and yes, I do live in a rather tall building." Thomas cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Alex, I'm sure you're busy. We shouldn't keep you." "No," I interrupted, surprising even myself. "No, I'm not busy. At least nothing that can't wait." I turned to James, who was watching the scene unfold with barely concealed curiosity. "James, please cancel my meetings for the day, all of them." As James nodded and retreated to make the necessary calls, I turned back to Thomas and Emma. I think we have a lot to talk about. Would you like to get some coffee or hot chocolate?" I added, glancing at Emma. Thomas hesitated, years of unspoken words and pent-up emotions evident in his eyes. But Emma's excited "yes, please" seemed to make the decision for him. "All right," he conceded. "I suppose we could spare a little time." As we walked towards a nearby cafe, Emma chattering excitedly between us, I felt as though I was waking up from a long, isolating dream. The New York streets I had walked countless times suddenly seemed different, brighter, more alive. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about stock prices or profit margins. Instead, my mind was filled with questions about the brother I had lost touch with and the niece I never knew I had. As we settled into a booth at the cafe, Emma happily sipping her hot chocolate, I realized that this unexpected encounter had the potential to change everything. Looking at Thomas's guarded expression and Emma's open, curious one, I knew that rebuilding these bridges wouldn't be easy. Years of silence and neglect had taken their toll, but as I sat there, listening to Emma's animated description of her school project and watching Thomas's face soften as he looked at his daughter, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. This chance meeting on a busy New York street had cracked open a door I thought was permanently closed. As I sipped my coffee and listened to the stories of the family I had pushed away, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not let this opportunity slip away. It was time to reconnect, to heal old wounds, and perhaps to fill that emptiness that success alone could never satisfy. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about myself, success, and the true meaning of wealth. As Emma's laughter filled the cafe, I couldn't help but feel that my life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. As the weeks passed following that fateful encounter, I found myself in uncharted territory. The carefully constructed walls I had built around my life began to crumble, revealing a landscape both familiar and frighteningly new. My first tentative steps towards reconnecting with Thomas and Emma were awkward, to say the least. Years of silence had created a chasm between us that seemed almost insurmountable. Our initial meetings were filled with stilted conversations and long uncomfortable pauses. Thomas remained guarded, his responses clipped and wary. It was clear that the weight of our shared past hung heavy between us. Emma, however, was a breath of fresh air. Unencumbered by the baggage of adult relationships, she approached our newfound connection with unbridled enthusiasm. Her curiosity about my life and her eagerness to share her own experiences became the bridge that slowly began to span the gap between Thomas and me. It was during one of our weekend outings, a trip to the Central Park Zoo that Emma had eagerly requested, that the first cracks in Thomas's armor began to show. As we watched Emma marvel at the sea lions, Thomas turned to me, his eyes holding a mix of sadness and resolve. "You know, Alex," he began, his voice low, "I've been carrying around your picture in my wallet all these years. I told myself it was to remind Emma that she had an uncle out there somewhere. But I think part of me always hoped we'd find our way back to each other someday." His words hit me like a physical blow. I had spent so many years convincing myself that cutting ties with my family was necessary for my success, that I had never stopped to consider the impact of my actions on those I'd left behind. "Thomas, I began, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly explain the choices I'd made, the hurt I'd caused? "I'm sorry," I finally managed, the inadequacy of those two words hanging heavy in the air between us. Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Emma as she pressed her face against the glass of the exhibit. "I know you are, Alex, but sorry doesn't erase the past decade. It doesn't make up for the missed birthdays, the holidays spent wondering if you even remembered we existed." His words stung, but I knew I deserved every bit of that pain. "You're right," I admitted. "I can't change the past. But I'm here now, and I want to make things right, if you'll let me." Thomas turned to face me then, his expression a complex mix of emotions. "It's not going to be easy, Alex. There's a lot you don't know about our lives, about what we've been through." I nodded, steeling myself for what was to come. "I'm ready to listen, Thomas, whatever you want to tell me." And so, as Emma continued her excited exploration of the zoo, Thomas began to unravel the story of the years we'd spent apart. He spoke of his struggles with a gambling addiction, a battle he'd fought in silence for years. He told me about meeting Emma's mother, Sarah, and how her love had given him the strength to seek help and turn his life around. But the happiness they'd found together was short-lived. Sarah had fallen ill shortly after Emma was born, her health deteriorating rapidly. Thomas's voice broke as he recounted the long nights spent in hospital waiting rooms, the agonizing decisions they'd had to make, and the final, heartbreaking goodbye. "I wanted to reach out to you then," Thomas admitted, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I was too proud, too afraid you'd see me as a failure. And then, as time passed, it just seemed impossible." I listened, my heart heavy with the weight of all I had missed, all the support I could have, should have, provided. The realization of how little I truly knew about my own brother's life was overwhelming. "Thomas, I had no idea," I said softly, struggling to find the right words. "If I had known, would it have made a difference?" Thomas asked, his tone not accusatory but genuinely questioning. I wanted to say yes, to assure him that I would have been there in an instant if I had known about his struggles, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. The person I had been back then, so focused on my own success and isolation, might not have responded the way I wished I had. "I don't know," I admitted honestly, "but I know it would make a difference now. I can't change the past, Thomas, but I want to be here for you and Emma moving forward. If you'll have me." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting back to Emma, who was now excitedly pointing out the penguins to a group of other children. "She needs family," he said finally. "And despite everything, your family, Alex." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, a tentative opening that I was determined not to squander. As we left the zoo that day, Emma chattering excitedly about her favorite animals and the ice cream we'd promised her, I felt a shift in the dynamics between Thomas and me. The wall between us hadn't come down entirely, but there were now cracks through which understanding and perhaps someday forgiveness could flow. Over the next few weeks, our meetings became more frequent. I found myself rearranging my schedule, pushing back meetings and delegating tasks I would never have entrusted to others before, all to make time for Thomas and Emma. We had dinners at my penthouse, where Emma marveled at the city views and insisted on helping my housekeeper prepare the meals. We spent weekends exploring the city, rediscovering New York through Emma's eyes. With each interaction, I learned more about the lives they had built without me. I heard stories of Emma's first steps, her first words, the small triumphs and challenges that made up their daily lives. And with each story, the regret for all I had missed grew stronger, as did my determination to be a part of their lives moving forward. It wasn't always smooth sailing. There were moments when old resentments bubbled to the surface, when a careless word or action would reopen old wounds. But we were trying, both of us, to bridge the gap that years of silence had created. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of my penthouse watching the sun set over the city, Thomas turned to me with a serious expression. "Alex, there's something I need to ask you," he began, his voice hesitant. "It's about Emma's future." I felt a flutter of anxiety in my chest. Despite our progress, I was acutely aware of how fragile our newfound relationship was. "What is it, Thomas?" He took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been offered a job. It's a great opportunity, something that could really turn things around for us, but it's in Chicago." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Just as we were starting to reconnect, just as I was beginning to forge a relationship with my niece, they might be moving hundreds of miles away. "I see," I said slowly, trying to process this unexpected development. "And you're considering taking it?" Thomas nodded. "I have to, Alex. The job market here has been tough, and this could provide the stability Emma and I need. But," he paused, seeming to wrestle with his next words, "I don't want to take Emma away from you. Not when you're just getting to know each other." I was touched by his consideration, even as my mind raced with the implications of their potential move. The old me would have seen this as an opportunity to retreat back into my isolated world of business and success. But the person I was becoming, the person who had started to understand the value of family, couldn't bear the thought of losing them again. That's when an idea began to form in my mind. It was impulsive, perhaps even a little crazy, but it felt right in a way few things in my life had recently. "What if," I began, the plan taking shape as I spoke, "what if I could offer you a job here in New York? Something that would provide the stability you need, but allow you and Emma to stay?" Thomas looked at me, surprise and a hint of suspicion in his eyes. "Alex, I appreciate the thought, but I don't want charity. And I'm not sure I'm qualified for anything in your company. I shook my head, my excitement growing as the idea solidified. It's not charity, Thomas, and it wouldn't be directly for my company. I've been thinking about branching out, about using some of my resources for something more meaningful. What would you say to helping me set up a community center in your neighborhood? Something that could really make a difference in people's lives. As I outlined my fledgling plan, I saw a spark of interest in Thomas's eyes. It wasn't a yes, not yet, but it was a possibility. A chance to keep my newly rediscovered family close, while also embarking on something that could give my wealth and influence real purpose. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the city skyline, I realized that this conversation might be the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Thomas and Emma, but for me as well. A chapter where success was measured not in dollars and cents, but in the strength of family bonds and the positive impact we could have on the world around us. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with potential pitfalls and challenges. But as I looked at Thomas, seeing a glimmer of the brother I once knew and the man he had become, I felt a sense of hope and excitement I hadn't experienced in years. Whatever came next, we would face it together, as a family. The weeks following my impulsive job offer to Thomas were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. I found myself navigating unfamiliar territory, both in my personal life and in the new venture I had proposed. The idea of the community center, born in a moment of desperation to keep my family close, had taken root and begun to grow into something much larger than I had initially envisioned. Thomas, after careful consideration and numerous discussions, had agreed to my proposal. However, he had one condition that took me by surprise. He wanted me to be actively involved in the project, not just as a financial backer, but as a hands-on participant. It was a challenge to my comfortable routine, but one I found myself eager to accept. Our first step was to scout locations in Thomas's neighborhood. I had rarely ventured into this part of the city, and walking its streets was an eye-opening experience. The contrast to my usual haunts was stark. Here, small businesses struggled to stay afloat, community spaces were in disrepair, and the signs of economic hardship were evident on every corner. This used to be such a vibrant area, Thomas explained as we walked, Emma skipping ahead of us. But in the last few years, it's really taken a hit. A lot of families are struggling, Alex. I nodded, taking in the boarded-up storefronts and faded community notices. It was a side of New York I had conveniently ignored for years, focused as I was on my own success. Now seeing it through Thomas's eyes and imagining Emma growing up here, I felt a new sense of purpose stirring within me. We finally came across an old abandoned recreation center. The building was in a state of disrepair, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows, but it had good bones and a central location in the neighborhood. This could be perfect, I mused, already envisioning the potential transformations. We could renovate it, modernize the facilities, create spaces for various programs. Thomas nodded, a spark of excitement in his eyes. It would mean a lot to the community to have this place up and running again. I remember coming here as a kid for after-school programs. As we stood there discussing possibilities, a woman approached us. She introduced herself as Maria Gonzalez, a longtime resident and community organizer. I couldn't help but overhear, she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. Are you planning to do something with the old rec center? We explained our ideas, and Maria's enthusiasm was infectious. She shared stories of the center's glory days and the vital role it had played in the community. As she spoke, I found myself drawn in by her passion and her intimate knowledge of the neighborhood's needs. We've been trying to get the city to renovate this place for years, Maria explained, but there's never enough funding, always other priorities. I exchanged a look with Thomas, seeing my own thoughts reflected in his eyes. This was exactly the kind of impact we had hoped to make. Ms. Gonzalez, I said, extending my hand. I think we may be able to help with that. Would you be interested in being part of this project? Maria's involvement turned out to be a turning point. Her connections in the community and her understanding of local needs helped shape our plans in ways I never could have anticipated. What had started as a vague idea of a community center evolved into a comprehensive plan for a multi-purpose facility that would offer after-school programs, job training, health services, and much more. As weeks turned into months, I found myself spending more and more time on the project. Board meetings and financial reports were interspersed with community consultations and meetings with local officials. It was a new world for me, one that challenged my preconceptions and pushed me out of my comfort zone in ways I hadn't experienced in years. Thomas thrived in this environment. His natural empathy and the perspective gained from his own struggles made him an invaluable asset in our planning. Watching him interact with community members, seeing the respect he commanded and the genuine care he showed, I felt a mix of pride and regret. Pride in the man my brother had become, and regret for all the years I had missed seeing him grow into this role. Emma, too, became an unexpected source of inspiration. Her innocent questions often led to insights we adults had overlooked. "Why can't the big room be used for dancing and homework?" she'd ask, leading us to rethink our space allocations. Her enthusiasm was contagious, reminding us of the joy and hope we were working to bring to the community. One particular memory stands out from those early months. We had organized a community feedback session, inviting local residents to share their thoughts on our plans. The turnout was larger than we had anticipated, and the community center was buzzing with energy and ideas. As I stood at the back of the room, watching Thomas and Maria lead the discussion, I felt a tug on my sleeve. I looked down to see Emma, her eyes wide with excitement. "Uncle Alex," she whispered, "are we really going to make all of this happen?" I knelt down to her level, struck by the hope in her voice. "We're certainly going to try our best, Emma." She nodded solemnly. "Good. Because I told my friends at school that my daddy and uncle were going to make the neighborhood better. I don't want to be a liar." Her words hit me hard. In that moment, I realized that this project had become about so much more than keeping Thomas and Emma in New York. It was about living up to the faith this little girl had in us, about making a real difference in people's lives. As the meeting continued, I found myself more engaged than ever. I listened intently to the community members' stories, tales of struggle, of resilience, of hopes for a better future. Each account added depth and purpose to our plans, turning what had been an abstract concept into a living, breathing mission. By the end of the night, our initial plans had been transformed. The community's input had reshaped our vision, making it more responsive to local needs and more ambitious in its scope. We were no longer just renovating a building, we were laying the groundwork for a transformation of the entire neighborhood. As we locked up the old center that night, Thomas turned to me with a grin. "You know, Alex, when you first suggested this, I thought you were just trying to keep us from moving to Chicago. But this is becoming something real, isn't it?" I nodded, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. "It is, and I have to thank you, Thomas. You and Emma. You've opened my eyes to a whole world I'd been ignoring." Thomas's expression softened. "Well, better late than never, right? Besides, you're making up for lost time pretty spectacularly." As we walked back to where James was waiting with the car, Emma between us, chattering excitedly about all the things she wanted to do in the new center, I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the summer evening. For years, I had measured my worth in dollars and cents, in stock prices and profit margins. Now I was beginning to see a different kind of value, one measured in smiles, in hope, in the potential for positive change. It was a new perspective, one that both excited and terrified me. That night, as I sat in my penthouse overlooking the city, I realized that my life had irrevocably changed. The skyline that had once represented my personal kingdom now seemed like a challenge. How much good could we do? How many lives could we touch? I thought of Emma's words, of the faith she had in us to make things better. I thought of Thomas and the strength he had shown in overcoming his struggles. I thought of Maria and the other community members we had met, their resilience in the face of adversity, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges I had never faced before. But as I looked out over the city, I knew that whatever came next, I was exactly where I needed to be. Little did I know that this was just the beginning. The community center project would not only transform the neighborhood, but would also set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything I thought I knew about success, family, and the true meaning of wealth. As I finally turned in for the night, my mind buzzing with plans and possibilities, I couldn't help but feel that the best was yet to come. As the summer faded into autumn, Our community center project gained momentum. What had started as a vague idea had blossomed into a full-fledged mission, consuming more and more of my time and energy. The old Alex, the one who lived for board meetings and profit margins, was slowly being replaced by someone I hardly recognized. Someone who found joy in community meetings and felt a thrill at the prospect of making a tangible difference in people's lives. However, as with any significant change, this transformation didn't come without its challenges. The first major hurdle appeared in the form of red tape. Despite our enthusiasm and the community's support, navigating the labyrinth of city regulations and permit processes proved to be a daunting task. I found myself in countless meetings with city officials trying to push our project through the bureaucratic maze. It was a far cry from the corporate negotiations I was used to, and I often felt out of my depth. But Thomas, with his patient demeanor and his ability to connect with people from all walks of life, proved to be an invaluable partner in these discussions. One particularly frustrating day, after yet another meeting that seemed to lead us nowhere, I vented my frustrations to Thomas as we walked back to the car. "I don't understand it," I fumed. "We're trying to do something good for the community. Why are they making it so difficult?" Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "Welcome to the real world, big brother. Not everything can be solved with a checkbook and a power suit." His words stung, but I knew he was right. This project was forcing me to confront the limitations of my usual approach to problems. Money and influence, the tools I had relied on for so long, weren't always enough in this new arena. As if sensing my dejection, Thomas clapped me on the shoulder. "Hey, don't worry. We'll figure it out. We're Reeves, remember? Stubbornness runs in our blood." His words and the easy camaraderie behind them lifted my spirits. It struck me then how much our relationship had evolved over the past few months. The awkwardness and tension of our early reunions had given way to a growing understanding and mutual respect. We were becoming true partners, not just in this project, but in life. Our breakthrough with the city finally came thanks to an unexpected source, Emma. During one of our family dinners, as Thomas and I were discussing our latest setback with the permits, Emma piped up. "Why don't you invite the mayor to see the center?" she suggested. Her fork paused midway to her mouth. "If he sees how important it is, maybe he'll help." Thomas and I exchanged glances, surprised by the simplicity and potential brilliance of her idea. It was a long shot, but at this point, we were willing to try anything. To our amazement, the mayor agreed to visit. The day of his tour, the entire community turned out to show their support. Maria had rallied the neighbors, and the street in front of the old recreation center was filled with families, each with a story to tell about what the new community center would mean to them. As we walked the mayor through the dilapidated building, outlining our vision for its transformation, I could see the impact the community's presence was having. This wasn't just a business proposal or a vanity project. It was a mission that an entire neighborhood had rallied behind. The mayor's visit marked a turning point. With his support, the regulatory hurdles began to clear, and we finally got the green light to begin renovations. It was a victory that the entire community celebrated, and I found myself swept up in their joy and optimism. However, as we delved deeper into the renovation process, we encountered a new set of challenges. The old building, charming as it was, harbored more problems than we had initially anticipated. Structural issues, asbestos, outdated electrical systems. Each day seemed to bring a new complication and an additional cost. I watched with growing concern as our budget estimates spiraled upward. While money had never been an issue for me personally, I had committed to funding this project through a foundation I had set up, separate from my main business interests. The foundation's resources, while substantial, were not unlimited. One evening, as Thomas and I pored over the latest budget revisions in my penthouse office, I finally voiced the concern that had been nagging at me. "Thomas," I began hesitantly, "I'm not sure the foundation can cover all of this. We might need to scale back our plans." I expected argument or disappointment. Instead, Thomas looked at me with understanding. "I know, Alex. I've been doing some calculations of my own, but before we start cutting, I have an idea." He outlined a plan to involve the community more directly in the renovation process. Local contractors could be hired at discounted rates. Community members with relevant skills could volunteer their time, and we could organize fundraising events to cover some of the additional costs. It'll take longer, Thomas admitted, but it'll also give the community a real sense of ownership over the center. This way, it's not just something we're giving them, it's something they're helping to build. I was hesitant at first. This approach was messier, less controlled than what I was used to. But as Thomas laid out his plan, I began to see the wisdom in it. This wasn't just about creating a building, it was about building a community. The next few months were a flurry of activity. We organized volunteer weekends, where community members came together to help with the renovations. Local businesses donated materials and services. Emma's school held a bake sale that raised a surprising amount for new children's books for the center's library. Through it all, I found myself more and more involved in the day-to-day aspects of the project. I was no longer just the financial backer. I was on site regularly, rolling up my sleeves and working alongside everyone else. It was hard work, often frustrating, but also deeply satisfying in a way I had never experienced before. One Saturday afternoon, as I took a break from painting one of the classrooms, I found myself sitting on the floor next to Maria. She looked at me with a mixture of amusement and respect. "You know, Mr. Reeves," she said, "when you first showed up here in your fancy suit, talking about community centers, I thought you were just another rich guy trying to feel good about himself. But I have to admit you've surprised me." I chuckled, looking down at my paint-splattered jeans and work boots. "I've surprised myself, to be honest." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "It's not easy, is it? Stepping out of your comfort zone, trying to make a real difference. But let me tell you, what you and Thomas are doing here, it means everything to this community." Her words struck a chord deep within me. I thought back to the man I had been just a few months ago, isolated, focused solely on my own success, unaware of the struggles and triumphs happening in communities like this one. The contrast was stark, and I realized with a start that I didn't miss that old life at all. As the day wound down and the volunteers began to disperse, I found Thomas and Emma waiting for me by the entrance. Emma, her face smudged with paint, ran up to me with a big smile. "Uncle Alex, did you see the mural we started in the teen room? It's going to be amazing." I ruffled her hair, marveling at her enthusiasm. "I can't wait to see it finished, Emma. You're quite the artist." As we walked to the car, Thomas nudged me with his elbow. "So, still having doubts about this project?" I shook my head, a smile tugging at my lips. "No doubts, it's challenging, it's unpredictable, and it's nothing like what I'm used to. But I wouldn't have it any other way." Thomas nodded, a look of pride in his eyes. "You've come a long way, big brother." Dad would be proud. The mention of our father, a subject we had both carefully avoided until now, caught me off guard. But instead of the usual pang of regret and unresolved emotions, I felt a warm sense of acknowledgement. Maybe, just maybe, we were finally on a path that would have made him proud. As we drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant hues, I felt a sense of contentment that had eluded me for years. The road ahead was still long and undoubtedly filled with more challenges. But for the first time in a long time, I was excited about the journey. Little did I know that the greatest challenges and the most profound revelations were still to come. The community center project was not just changing the neighborhood, it was changing me in ways I had yet to fully comprehend. And as we turned onto the street leading to Thomas's apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the cusp of something truly transformative, not just for the community, but for our family as well. As autumn gave way to winter, the community center project continued to evolve, bringing with it new challenges and unexpected revelations. The cold weather didn't dampen the community's enthusiasm. If anything, it seemed to fuel their determination to see the center completed before the harshest months set in. One crisp morning in late November, I found myself walking through the neighborhood with Maria, discussing plans for a winter coat drive we were organizing as part of the center's outreach programs. As we turned a corner, Maria suddenly stopped, her eyes fixed on a small rundown house across the street. "You know," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia, "that used to be one of the nicest houses on the block. Old Mrs. Reeves kept it in perfect condition, always had the most beautiful flowers in her garden." I froze, the name sending a jolt through me. "Reeves, are you sure?" Maria nodded, looking at me curiously. "Yes, Eleanor Reeves. She was a pillar of this community for decades. Moved away about, must be 30 years ago now, why do you ask? My mind was reeling. Eleanor Reeves, my grandmother's name. Could it be possible? I had always known that my grandparents had lived in the city before moving to the suburbs, but I had never known exactly where. My father had rarely spoken of his childhood, and by the time I was old enough to be curious about such things, both my grandparents had passed away. Maria, I said slowly, I think that might have been my grandmother's house. Maria's eyes widened in surprise. Your grandmother? Well, I'll be. You know, now that you mention it, there is a resemblance. She had that same determined look you get when you're working on the center plans. As we continued our walk, my mind was elsewhere. I found myself seeing the neighborhood through new eyes, imagining my father as a young boy running down these very streets, my grandmother tending to her garden. It was a strange feeling, as if the past and present were suddenly overlapping, revealing connections I had never known existed. That evening I called Thomas, eager to share my discovery. His reaction was one of disbelief and excitement. Are you sure, Alex? He asked, his voice filled with wonder. I mean, what are the odds? I'm going to do some digging, I replied, already mentally cataloguing the old family documents I had stored away. But Maria seemed pretty certain about the name and the time frame. It can't be a coincidence. As we talked, a plan began to form. If this truly was our family's old neighborhood, perhaps there were other connections waiting to be uncovered. We agreed to spend the next weekend exploring the area together, hoping to piece together more of our family's history. That Saturday, Thomas, Emma, and I set out on what Emma enthusiastically dubbed our family history treasure hunt. We started at the old house, which looked even more forlorn up close. As we stood on the sidewalk, I tried to imagine it as it must have been in my grandmother's time, well-maintained with a garden full of flowers. Do you think we could go inside? Emma asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. I shook my head. I'm afraid not, sweetheart. Someone else lives there now. But maybe someday we can fix it up, make it beautiful again. As we walked the neighborhood, we discovered more potential links to our past. An elderly man trimming his hedges remembered the Reeves family, recalling how my grandfather had helped organize the neighborhood's first block party. The owner of a small local deli showed us a faded photograph on the wall, pointing out a young man who bore a striking resemblance to my father. With each discovery, I felt a growing connection, not just to my family's history, but to the neighborhood itself. The stories we uncovered painted a picture of a close-knit community, one that had faced challenges together and celebrated each other's successes. It was a far cry from the isolated world I had built for myself over the years. As the day wore on, we found ourselves in a small park near the community center. While Emma played on the swings, Thomas and I sat on a bench processing all we had learned. You know, Thomas said thoughtfully, I think I understand now why Dad was always so reluctant to talk about his childhood. It must have been hard for him, leaving all this behind. I nodded, thinking of the ambitious young man our father must have been, determined to make his mark on the world. He probably thought he was doing the right thing, giving us a better life in the suburbs, but I wonder if he ever regretted leaving this all behind. And now, here we are, Thomas mused, right back where it all started. Funny how life works sometimes, isn't it? As we watched Emma laugh and play, oblivious to the weight of history surrounding us, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of responsibility. We weren't just renovating a building or helping a neighborhood. We were, in a way, reclaiming a part of our family's legacy. The next few weeks saw a renewed surge of energy in our work on the community center. Knowing that we were, in a sense, honoring our grandparents' memory gave the project a new dimension of meaning. I found myself sharing stories of our discoveries with the volunteers and community members, strengthening the bonds between us all. However, our family history revelations also brought new complications. As word spread about our connection to the neighborhood, some community members began to view our involvement with suspicion. Whispers started circulating that we were only interested in the area for sentimental reasons, or worse, that we had plans to gentrify the neighborhood once the community center was complete. These rumors came to a head during a community meeting in early December. As Thomas and I presented our latest plans for the center, a man in the back of the room stood up, his face etched with anger. "How do we know this isn't just some rich boy's vanity project?" he demanded. "You come in here, talking about your family history. But where have you been all these years while we've been struggling? How do we know you won't just abandon us again once you've had your fun playing savior?" The room fell silent, all eyes darting between the man and us. I felt a flash of anger at the accusation, but as I looked around at the faces in the crowd, some supportive, others wary, I realized that his fears weren't entirely unfounded. Thomas started to respond, but I put a hand on his arm, stepping forward instead. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet the man's challenging gaze. "You're right," I said, my voice steady despite the churning in my stomach. "We haven't been here, and you have every reason to be skeptical of our intentions." A murmur ran through the crowd, but I pressed on. "The truth is, until a few months ago, I was exactly the kind of person you're afraid we still are. I was focused on my own success, oblivious to the struggles of communities like this one. And yes, discovering our family's connection to this neighborhood was a surprise to us." I paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with as many people as I could. "But that's not why we're here now. We're here because we've come to care deeply about this community. Not just its past, but its present and its future. We're here because we believe in the potential of this neighborhood and the incredible people who call it home." Taking another deep breath, I continued, "I can't change the past. I can't undo years of neglect or make up for lost time overnight. But I can promise you this, we are committed to this project and to this community for the long haul. This isn't about assuaging guilt or reliving some idealized version of the past. It's about building a better future, together." The room was quiet for a moment after I finished speaking. Then, slowly, Maria stood up. "I've known the Reeves brothers for months now," she said, her voice firm. "I've seen them work alongside us, listen to our concerns, adapt their plans to meet our needs. Whatever their reasons for starting this project, I believe they're here for the right reasons now." Her words seemed to break the tension in the room. Soon others were standing up, sharing their own experiences of working with us on the center. The man who had challenged us remained skeptical, but I could see the hostility in his eyes soften slightly. As the meeting concluded, I felt drained but oddly exhilarated. We had faced a significant challenge and come through it stronger. The experience had forced me to articulate my commitment to the project in a way I never had before, even to myself. Later that night, as I sat in my penthouse reflecting on the day's events, I realized how much I had changed. The Alex of a few months ago would have been outraged at being challenged, would have tried to use his money and influence to silence dissent. But now I understood the value of transparency, of earning trust rather than demanding it. As I looked out over the city lights, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold more challenges, more moments of doubt and difficulty. But for the first time in my life, I felt truly connected to something larger than myself, to a community, to a legacy, to a future full of possibility. Little did I know that the greatest test of this newfound commitment was yet to come, a challenge that would force me to choose between the life I had built and the one I was discovering, between the man I had been and the man I was becoming. As winter tightened its grip on the city, the community center project entered a critical phase. With the major renovations nearing completion, we were shifting our focus to the programs and services that would bring the center to life. It was an exciting time, filled with possibility and promise. However, as I was about to discover, it was also a time that would test my commitment in ways I never anticipated. One bitterly cold morning in January, I arrived at my office to find my assistant, Sarah, waiting for me with an unusually serious expression. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice tense, "the board has called an emergency meeting. They're waiting for you in the conference room." Puzzled and slightly concerned, I made my way to the conference room. As I entered, the atmosphere hit me like a physical force, a mix of tension, disapproval, and barely concealed anger. The faces of the board members, people I had worked with for years, were uniformly grim. "Alex," began Gerald, the head of the board, his voice cold, "we need to talk about your extracurricular activities." For the next hour, I sat and listened as the board laid out their concerns. They had been watching my involvement with the community center project with growing alarm. My frequent absences from the office, My delegation of key responsibilities, my apparent lack of focus on the company's core business, all of it had led them to question my commitment to Reeves Enterprises. "The numbers don't lie, Alex," Gerald continued, sliding a report across the table to me. "Our stock price has dropped, we've lost ground to our competitors, and investor confidence is wavering. This pet project of yours is becoming a liability to the company." I leafed through the report, my mind racing. The facts were there in black and white. While I had been pouring my energy into the community center, my company had indeed been suffering. How had I not noticed? "We've been patient, Alex," another board member chimed in. "We understood your need for personal growth, but enough is enough. It's time to refocus on what's really important." I looked up from the report, meeting the eyes of each board member in turn. "And what exactly are you proposing?" Gerald leaned forward, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "It's simple, Alex. You need to step back from this community project, completely. Focus on rebuilding investor confidence, on getting our numbers back where they should be. If you can't do that..." He trailed off, the unspoken threat hanging in the air. As I left the conference room, my head was spinning. I had always prided myself on my business acumen, on my ability to balance multiple priorities. How had I let things slip so badly? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? I spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of my usual routine while my mind grappled with the choice before me. On one hand, there was the company I had built from the ground up, the wealth and influence I had worked so hard to achieve. On the other, there was the community center, the connections I had formed, the sense of purpose I had discovered. That evening, I found myself driving to Thomas's apartment, needing to talk through my dilemma with the one person who might understand. As I explained the situation, I could see the concern growing in Thomas's eyes. "They can't be serious," he said when I finished. "After everything we've accomplished, everything we're about to do with the center," I sighed, sinking deeper into Thomas's worn but comfortable couch. "They're dead serious, Thomas. And the worst part is, I can't even blame them. I've been so focused on the center that I've neglected my responsibilities to the company." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then asked softly, "So, what are you going to do?" It was the question I had been avoiding all day. "I don't know," I admitted. "The logical thing would be to do what they ask, step back from the center, refocus on the business. It's what the old me would have done without hesitation." "But," Thomas prompted, knowing there was more, "but the thought of walking away from the center, from everything we've built, it feels wrong. Like I'd be betraying not just the community, but myself." As we talked late into the night, weighing pros and cons, considering alternatives, I realized that this wasn't just a choice between two projects. It was a choice between two versions of myself, the successful businessman I had been, and the engaged community member I was becoming. The next few days were a blur of meetings and sleepless nights. I threw myself into both the company and the community center with renewed vigor, desperately trying to find a way to balance both. But deep down, I knew that something had to give. The turning point came, surprisingly, during one of our regular volunteer weekends at the center. As I worked alongside community members, painting walls and assembling furniture, I found myself in conversation with an elderly gentleman named Joe. Joe had lived in the neighborhood for over 5 decades and had seen it through its ups and downs. As we worked, he shared stories of the area's history, of the challenges it had faced and overcome. "You know," he said, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow, "I've seen a lot of people come through here promising change. Politicians, businessmen, do-gooders of all stripes. Most of them, they show up for a photo op, make some grand promises, and then disappear when the real work starts." I felt a pang of guilt, wondering if he was including me in that assessment. But Joe wasn't finished. "But you and your brother," he continued, his eyes meeting mine, "you're different. You're here, day after day, getting your hands dirty with the rest of us. You listen. You adapt. You persist. That means something." His words struck a chord deep within me. I thought of all the people I had met over the past months, of the trust they had placed in us, of the hope the center represented. And in that moment, surrounded by the buzz of activity and the sense of shared purpose, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I called an emergency board meeting of my own. As I stood before the group of men and women who had been my colleagues and mentors for so long, I felt a mix of trepidation and resolve. "I've made a decision," I began, my voice steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. "I'm stepping down as CEO of Reeves Enterprises." The room erupted in a chorus of protests and questions, but I held up a hand, asking for silence. "I've given this a lot of thought," I continued. "You were right. The company needs someone who can give it their full attention, their full commitment. And I've realized that right now that person isn't me." I went on to outline my plan, a gradual transition of leadership, a restructuring of my role to minimize disruption to the company. It wasn't an easy conversation, and I could see the disappointment and disbelief on many faces. But as I spoke, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. As I left the office that day, carrying a box of personal items, I felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness at leaving behind the world I had known for so long, excitement for the path ahead, and a deep sense of peace that I had made the right choice. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "How did it go?" I smiled, typing back a quick reply. "It's done. Meet me at the center? We have work to do." As I drove through the city streets, from the sleek skyscrapers of the business district to the familiar streets of our old neighborhood, I felt like I was shedding one skin and growing into another. The road ahead was uncertain, full of challenges I had never faced before. But for the first time in a long time, I was truly excited about the future. Little did I know that this decision, difficult as it was just the beginning. The coming months would bring challenges and opportunities I could never have anticipated, testing my resolve and pushing me to grow in ways I never imagined. But in that moment, driving towards the community center and the new life I had chosen, I felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The weeks following my resignation from Reeves Enterprises were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. News of my decision spread quickly, eliciting a range of reactions from shock and disappointment to admiration and support. The business world buzzed with speculation about my motives, while the local community welcomed my increased involvement with a mixture of excitement and cautious optimism. As I threw myself fully into the community center project, I discovered a newfound energy and sense of purpose. Without the constant pull of corporate responsibilities, I was able to immerse myself completely in the day-to-day challenges and triumphs of bringing the center to life. One sunny morning in early spring, as Thomas and I stood surveying the nearly completed renovation, I felt a surge of pride and anticipation. "You know," Thomas said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "when you first suggested this project, I thought you'd lost your mind, but now I can't imagine doing anything else." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "Hey, it's funny how life works out, isn't it? A year ago, I couldn't have imagined walking away from the company. Now I can't imagine going back." As we walked through the building, checking on the various areas nearing completion, we were joined by Maria and several other community members who had become integral to the project. "Alex, Thomas," Maria called out, excitement evident in her voice. "We've just heard from the city. They've approved our application for additional funding for the youth programs." The news was met with cheers and congratulations. It was a significant victory, one that would allow us to expand our plans for after-school tutoring, mentorship programs, and vocational training for local youth. As the group dispersed, each heading off to work on their respective areas of the project, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. The challenges we had faced, the obstacles we had overcome, the relationships we had built, all of it had contributed to creating something truly special. However, our work was far from over. As the center's opening day approached, new challenges emerged. We grappled with staffing decisions, program logistics, and the ever-present concern of long-term sustainability. The cushion of my personal wealth, which I had been using to supplement the project's funding, wouldn't last forever. We needed to find ways to make the center self-sustaining in the long run. It was during one of our late-night planning sessions that Emma, who had taken to joining us occasionally, much to her delight and our amusement, came up with an idea that would prove transformative. "Why don't you teach people how to do business stuff?" she asked, looking up from her homework. "You know, like you used to do, Uncle Alex. But for regular people who want to start their own shops and things." Thomas and I exchanged glances, intrigued by the suggestion. You mean like entrepreneurship classes? I asked. Emma nodded enthusiastically. Yeah, and maybe you could help them get started, like what's it called when big companies help little ones? An incubator, Thomas supplied, a spark of excitement in his eyes. Alex, that's brilliant. We could create a small business incubator as part of the center. It would provide valuable skills to the community and potentially create new jobs in the area. The idea took hold, and over the next few weeks, we worked tirelessly to develop a comprehensive small business program. I drew on my years of experience in the corporate world, adapting complex business concepts into accessible lessons for aspiring entrepreneurs. As word of the program spread, we were inundated with applications from community members eager to turn their ideas into reality. There was Maria's nephew, who dreamed of opening a sustainable coffee shop, a group of local artists who wanted to start a cooperative gallery, a young tech enthusiast with plans for a computer repair service. The energy and creativity of these aspiring entrepreneurs was infectious. I found myself energized by their passion, inspired by their ideas, and humbled by their determination to succeed against the odds. One participant in particular, a single mother named Jasmine, left a lasting impression on me. She had a plan for a mobile beauty salon that would cater to homebound seniors and busy professionals. Her idea was solid, but she struggled with the financial aspects of her business plan. I spent several evenings working with Jasmine, breaking down complex financial concepts into manageable pieces. Watching her eyes light up as she grasped each new concept, seeing her confidence grow as her business plan took shape, it was more satisfying than any multi-million-dollar deal I had ever closed. As the center's programs took shape and gained momentum, we began to see tangible changes in the community. New businesses sprouted up, bringing fresh energy and opportunities to the neighborhood. The after-school programs saw improved grades and increased college acceptances among local students. The community health initiatives led to better outcomes and increased awareness of preventative care. But perhaps the most significant change was the one I saw in myself. The man who had once measured his worth by the size of his bank account and the power of his business empire was gone. In his place was someone who found joy in mentoring young entrepreneurs, who felt a sense of accomplishment in helping a struggling student master a difficult concept, who measured success not in dollars, but in lives improved. This transformation didn't go unnoticed. One evening, as Thomas and I were locking up the center after a particularly long day, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. You know, Alex, he said, I don't think I've ever seen you this happy. Even when you were at the top of your game in the corporate world, you never seemed this content. I pondered his words as we walked to our cars. I think you're right, I admitted. Back then, I was always chasing the next big deal, the next achievement. I never took the time to appreciate what I had, or to consider the impact I was having on the world around me. Thomas nodded, a knowing smile on his face. And now, I said, gesturing back at the center, I feel like I'm part of something bigger than myself. Like what I'm doing really matters, not just to me, but to an entire community. As I drove home that night, I found myself taking a detour through the neighborhood. I passed by the small businesses that had sprung up as a result of our incubator program, the park where local kids now played safely thanks to our community safety initiatives, the clinic that provided vital health services to those who might otherwise go without care. Each site filled me with a sense of pride and purpose I had never experienced in my corporate life. It wasn't always easy. There were still challenges to face, obstacles to overcome, but for the first time in my life I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. As I finally pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Don't forget, Uncle Alex, career day at school tomorrow. You promised to come talk about being a community superhero. Her words, not mine. I chuckled, sending back a quick confirmation. As I got ready for bed, I found myself looking forward to the next day, eager to share my experiences with Emma's classmates and perhaps inspire the next generation of community leaders. Lying in bed, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. From the chance encounter that reunited me with Thomas and introduced me to Emma, to the discovery of our family's history in the neighborhood, to the difficult decision to leave my old life behind, Every step had led me here. I drifted off to sleep with a smile on my face, excited for what the future might hold. Little did I know that the greatest challenge and the most profound revelation of my journey was yet to come. But whatever lay ahead, I felt ready to face it, secure in the knowledge that I was no longer alone, but part of a community that had become my home and my family. As the seasons turned and another year passed, the community center had become the beating heart of the neighborhood. What had once been a dream, then a construction site and later a fledgling operation, was now a thriving hub of activity and hope. The transformation wasn't just in the physical space or the programs we offered, but in the spirit of the community itself. On a warm summer evening, as we prepared for the center's first anniversary celebration, I found myself reflecting on the incredible journey of the past 2 years. The struggles, the triumphs, the unexpected twists and turns that had led me from the pinnacle of corporate success to this new life of community service. The anniversary event was in full swing, the center's courtyard filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and excited chatter. Community members of all ages mingled, sharing stories of how the center had impacted their lives. I moved through the crowd, my heart swelling with each conversation, each smile, each word of gratitude. As I made my way to the small stage we had set up for speeches, I caught sight of Thomas and Emma near the refreshment table. Thomas gave me a thumbs up, while Emma beamed with pride. They had been my anchors throughout this journey, my family in every sense of the word. Taking the microphone, I looked out over the sea of faces, faces that had become familiar and dear to me over the past 2 years. I saw Jasmine, whose mobile beauty salon was now a thriving business employing 3 other community members. There was Joe, the elderly gentleman whose words had helped solidify my decision to commit fully to the center. Maria stood near the front, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of joy. 2 years ago, I began, my voice thick with emotion. I stood on this very spot, though it looked quite different then. I talked about plans and possibilities, about what this center could mean for our community. But the truth is, I had no idea of the profound impact it would have, not just on this neighborhood, but on me personally. As I spoke, sharing stories of the center's successes and the incredible resilience of the community, I felt a sense of completion, of having come full circle. The man who had once measured his worth in stock prices and profit margins now found his greatest satisfaction in the smiles of children attending after-school programs, in the pride of adults acquiring new skills, in the strengthened bonds of a community coming together. After the speech, as the celebration continued around me, I found a quiet moment with Thomas and Emma. "You did it, Uncle Alex," Emma said, hugging me tightly. "You really are a community superhero." I chuckled, ruffling her hair affectionately. "We did it, Emma. All of us, together." Thomas nodded, his eyes reflecting the pride I felt. "It's amazing, isn't it? How different things are now compared to 2 years ago." For all of us. As we stood there, taking in the joyous scene around us, a commotion near the entrance caught our attention. An elderly woman had just arrived, supported by a younger man who seemed to be her son. There was something hauntingly familiar about her, something that tugged at the edges of my memory. Maria hurried over to greet the newcomers, her face lighting up with recognition. She spoke briefly with them before turning and scanning the crowd, her eyes finally landing on me. With a wave, she beckoned me over. As I approached, the elderly woman's eyes locked onto mine, and suddenly, I knew. Even through the lines that age had etched on her face, I recognized the eyes that smiled out from the old family photos I had pored over in recent months. "Aunt Eleanor?" I breathed, hardly daring to believe it. The woman's face broke into a warm smile. "Alexander," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "It's been a long time." In that moment, it felt as though the past and present collided. Here was my father's sister, the aunt I had barely known, standing in the heart of the community that had once been her home, the community that had become my home. Over the next hour, as the celebration continued around us, Aunt Eleanor shared stories that filled in the gaps of our family history. She spoke of her childhood in the neighborhood, of the close-knit community that had existed then. She told us about my father as a young man, his dreams and aspirations, and the difficult decision to leave the area in search of better opportunities. Your father always intended to come back, she said, her eyes misty with memories, to give back to the community that had given us so much. But life has a way of taking us on unexpected paths. As I listened, I felt a deep sense of connection to my family's past, to the community's present, and to the future we were building together. It was as if the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place, completing a picture I hadn't even known I was creating. Later that night, as the celebration wound down and we began the process of cleaning up, I found myself back on the small stage, looking out over the now quiet courtyard. Thomas joined me, handing me a cup of coffee. "Quite a day, huh?" he said, his voice quiet in the evening stillness. I nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It feels like everything has come full circle. Like this is where we were always meant to end up. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, I've been thinking. With the center running smoothly and all the new initiatives we've got going, maybe it's time we looked at expanding. There are other neighborhoods, other communities that could benefit from what we've learned here." I turned to him, surprised and intrigued. "So you want to start other centers?" He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Why not? We've got the experience, the model, and think of the impact we could have on a larger scale." As we discussed the possibilities, I felt a familiar surge of excitement, the same feeling I used to get when contemplating a new business venture. But this was different. This wasn't about personal gain or corporate success. This was about creating lasting, meaningful change in people's lives. As we locked up the center and prepared to head home, Emma, who had been helping with the cleanup, came running up to us. "Dad, Uncle Alex," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "I've decided what I want to do when I grow up. I want to run a community center, just like this one. I want to help people and make a difference like you guys do." Her words hit me with unexpected force. In that moment, I saw the true legacy of what we had built here. It wasn't just about the programs we'd created or the lives we'd touched. It was about inspiring the next generation to carry on the work of building strong, compassionate communities. As we drove home that night, the city lights twinkling around us, I felt a profound sense of peace and purpose. The journey that had begun with a chance encounter on a busy street had led me here, to a life richer and more fulfilling than I could have ever imagined. I thought about the man I had been 2 years ago, successful by society's standards but isolated and unfulfilled. I thought about the challenges we had faced, the obstacles we had overcome, and the lives we had touched along the way. And I thought about the future, the possibilities that lay ahead, the work still to be done. As we pulled up to Thomas's apartment, Emma, half asleep in the back seat, mumbled, "Uncle Alex, are you staying for breakfast tomorrow? We're having pancakes." I smiled, feeling the warmth of family and belonging wash over me. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart." Watching Thomas carry a sleepy Emma into the building, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought me to this point. I had started this journey seeking to reconnect with my family, to find a sense of purpose beyond the corporate world. What I had found was so much more: a community, a calling, and a chance to make a real difference in the world. As I drove to my own home, the first light of dawn beginning to streak the sky, I felt ready for whatever the future might hold. There would be challenges ahead, new obstacles to overcome, but I was no longer facing them alone. I had my family, my community, and a sense of purpose that filled me with hope and determination. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it felt like it was just beginning. But whatever lay ahead, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough.